If you've ever thought to yourself, I'd rather just read about this than actually do it, you're not alone. The Enneagram 5 newsletter exists to help you move from knowing to experiencing. Every Saturday, you'll get insights designed to help fives grow without overwhelm. Sign up for free today at enneagram5.com/newsletter or visit the link in the description. Now on to the show. Okay, so our guest tonight, we're welcoming back to the Enneagram 5 audience and what do we call this? The studio, the Enneagram 5 studio, Liz Landry.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I wanted so bad to do an applause sound there. I could have done it.
You might remember Liz from our episode entitled, Is Cody a Sociopath? And honestly, that was one of my favorite conversations that we've had on this podcast. So we wanted to bring her back on and have a conversation around something that I personally have been dealing with this year. And we've talked about it a bit before in the podcast, but we recorded an episode for this upcoming season called Death and Grief. And so Cody and I shared our experiences and kind of how we feel about the whole grieving process and death in general. And I felt like that's a topic that I wanted to get some more perspective on, especially from someone who might know a bit more about what they're talking about. So we have Liz here. Liz is a professional therapist and clinical social worker. She's very familiar with the topic of grief and how to help people work their way through grief and that process. And so welcome to the show, Liz.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me back. It was so fun to get to talk to you all and pick your brains about Cody's sociopathic tendencies last time. So I'm really interested to hear what you guys bring to the conversation today.
Yeah, I'm also interested because we've not talked about what we're talking about.
No, this is like a dry run. So you're getting like completely real here.
Yeah.
It's interesting because as you guys were talking, I was, of course, thinking about grief and how that relates. And it's interesting that you mentioned grief as death. And I think that is definitely a component of grief, right? That's what most people typically think of is death, losing someone, things like that. But I talk to my clients about grief almost every week because grief is an expectation that you're having to realize isn't being met, essentially, right? So we all know that none of us get out of this life alive. We know that it's, finite. And especially whenever someone leaves unexpectedly, that's really hard because then your life isn't what you expected it to be, right? Like you think that you're going to come home to them. You think you're going to be able to call them. And then having to readjust to all of those things is really difficult. Cody, you mentioned like, oh, I should be happier. Like, I guess I should be better, right? And I think there's a part that like grieves that your life is, that you're doing these things in life that you feel good about, but that you don't emotionally feel good about them, right? And there can be grief in that dissonance and thinking like, oh, there are things that I'm doing well and I expect me to be happier and I'm not, right? Or grief in where you thought you'd be right now. Josiah, grief in how you thought you would be able to write your book and who you thought you could be as an author and who you thought you could be as a dad and a full-time writer and all of these things. And, grief is something we actually deal with every day because we have to constantly readjust our expectations and we have to kind of constantly reassess what isn't working or what we thought would work. And in that comes like frustration and the longing for what we expected, which is essentially grief.
I love that. So essentially how you would define grief is more of a, that longing.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. For anything. We long for so many things in life. I mean, that's part of what propels our dreams. That's part of what propels our passions is longing and chasing those things, including people, including aspirations we have. And those things that are not met then become lost expectations, which then turn into grief and longing because we can't get them back often.
Mm-hmm. Well, that just puts a whole different spin on this conversation. Because there's a lot of places that I want to go with that, and I think we could talk about. But maybe we can take a step back and look at, how do you go about that? Like, what's the advice that you give as you are? I know every kind of situation is unique to the person, but in general, what are some of the things that you see people going through that process of grief, and how do you help them through that?
Yeah. So as a therapist, one of the common misconceptions about what I do is give people professional advice. And that's often, that's not what I'm clinically supposed to do. And that's also not what my job is. It's to guide you to your own answers, because you're the one who knows about yourself. I'm just the one who's encouraging you to talk about it, right? And so with grief, it's often assessing, where did you learn that these expectations are something that you need to live up to? Where did you decide that this is someone you have to be? Who told you that? Is that something you want to hold on to? How did you decide that your life wasn't going to be good because it's different now? Why does that hurt for you? And those are all questions that we often explore in any type of transition in life. Like, just where did that come from? Why do you think that that's what you have to be happy? And is there another way to redefine and reframe what you're experiencing that can make it sad, but also acceptable and excited for the future, right? Like, sadness and grief are a natural emotion, but you don't have to stay in them. You can accept them and move through them if you're able to reframe at the other side and think about where your expectations came from and why there's that longing in the first place.
Yeah, I feel like too, so often as a five, I feel like grief, and it has popped up in my life in times where I didn't see it coming. And it's always the times, at least when I was maybe younger and less comfortable with my emotions, and less comfortable with, or less accepting maybe of myself and my emotions, less loving of myself. I felt grief was just this thing that caused me to be out of control. I think I've talked about before on the podcast where I had this whole death anxiety thing that happened for so long, where it started when I was in the shower one day and realized, and I didn't have this framework for death, and it was only from religious background. And when I took all of that framework away, I didn't have that framework anymore, and I didn't believe anything happened after we die. So having to come to a realization that I had never thought about before this moment, that when I die, nothing happens. I'd never really accepted that. And so for some reason, after my grandmother died, who was by far and large one of my favorite people ever in my entire life, and had a very deep and strong connection with her. And so I was contemplating just kind of letting my mind wander. And I was, thinking about her not existing at all anywhere in space and time anymore. And then somehow I got to this place where I'm like, I'm going to be there. And one day I'm going to be breathing my last breath and will not be here anymore. And this idea of not being conscious. And there was just something happened. It clicked in me where I was unable to process that emotion, and absolutely had a full on nervous breakdown, a complete anxiety attack. And I had to fall down in the shower, and I gripped the sides of immediately my brain went to referencing what do you do in an anxiety attack? I gripped the sides, I put my hands on the ground and on the sides of the tub and thought about breathing slowly, deep breaths, what am I touching? Everything. I'm where am I right now? And just trying not to pass out.
Yeah.
And, and that was my first real anxiety attack. And then I went to the doctor a couple months later and was talking about it. And I was like, I don't know what's going on. I just feel like I have heart palpitations. And she was like, really? Where do you feel like you have heart palpitations? And I was like, right here. And it just always feels like I'm really tight in my chest. And she's like, does it feel like somebody's strangling you? And I was like, yeah. And she goes, you have anxiety. I was like, no, I don't. I've never had anxiety. And then she's like, well, tell me about these heart palpitations. And then so I, did this whole thing. Of course, she was like, no, you have anxiety. And I got on anxiety meds, and they have, for the most part, helped after for a long time. But what they did do also was separate this idea of feeling actually like I'm spiraling, and allowing me to be in a place where I can try to process emotion a little bit better, and also accept things like grief and anxiety and what those things are actually trying to tell me, or what my body is trying to tell me, And so, yeah, I don't know. It's the idea of grief is a really interesting thing. And some of the things that you've said so far about just kind of defining grief kind of makes me kind of look at it a little bit differently. But as a five, it's such a unique perspective, I feel like, for grief, because of the fact that we oftentimes go through these, levels of, if we're going to talk about the Enneagram, the different levels of I don't like, what did we decide on? Not levels of health.
Not levels of health, but levels of development.
Yeah. The different levels of development. I don't like the term levels of health. We're going to use levels of development. And, it's a ladder, right? We're just going up and down that ladder all the time. And so depending on where you are is how you're going to respond to grief and feel negatively towards that feeling or any feeling, or be in a place where you're more accepting of those feelings and what it's, what your body's trying to teach you. So yeah,
Absolutely.
I don't know. It's very interesting. I've had a very odd experience with that over the last 3 years specifically. It's just very strange.
Yeah, I think you made such a good point there about it all being information. That's something I talk about really often with my clients who tend to intellectualize things, which is a word I talked about last time. It means thinking about your emotions instead of feeling them. Grief is something we're really good at doing that with, especially fives, because it's physical, right? Like grief is like dying when you think about it in terms of, death. You see what's happened, you go to the funeral, you do the steps. It's so ritualistic, especially in our culture, that you're like, okay, I did the things, I'm over it, right? And that's not necessarily how you process it. And so it can be really hard to sit in because it also does feel consuming. And that can be scary because it doesn't feel like you're in control. And I think you made a good point about all of your emotions being something that tells you information about yourself. Often clients come in and they frame emotions specifically around grief as good or bad, right? I'm grieving, that's bad, I should get over it. And that's not true, right?
Like you're less than healthy. Yeah.
Exactly. Or like, it's been, 12 years. Why can't I get over my partner's death? Why can't I get over, this job loss forever ago? Well, it's because your body is telling you something. Your mind is telling you that that is important to you. And that's a lesson that you haven't accepted. And you're not living in a way that tells your body that that's important to you. Like if you had a job that was really important to you and you had to leave it. Let's say, for example, you had to leave a job that you loved to raise your family. You love your family and you grieve your job 10 years later. You might feel bad for grieving your job, because you're like, I love my family, I love my life, right? And I would reframe that to a client as, well, have you considered that this might be an opportunity to understand yourself a little bit deeper and realize that there's a part of yourself that really wants to be expressed. Whatever you were doing in that job was something that was really fulfilling and not something you're getting in your current life. So you're longing for it still because you haven't filled that yet. You haven't created a space in your life to express that still. So it's not bad that you're grieving it. It's more information and you haven't accepted the information. So it's going to have to keep coming up until you can make space in your life for it.
That's really good. I love that.
Thanks.
That was one of those I wanted to yell preach really loudly. Because, it's funny that you say that because I've actually been reflecting a lot lately on the things that I miss about working in churches, which is very strange as somebody who claims atheism and despises the church passionately for various systematic reasons. But it's not missing being in church. It's missing the qualities and those things that those jobs gave me, which is, as a five, I knew what I was doing and I felt competent at what I was doing because I'd practiced my whole life to do what I was doing and also was playing music. I was doing creative things and being paid for it. And there was a lot of things about it that it was almost like escaping and to a bubble of where in church in many ways is kind of like living in a bubble anyway. And so it's this whole ecosystem and I was existing inside that. Outside of that, I felt like those skills were worthless. And once I got out of it, they kind of are. But you take a lot of that with you. And yeah, sure. The job that I have now, I get to apply some of those performance aspects to sales or whatever. But I've also been very much reflecting on the fact that the job I have now is absolutely draining and is not really what I want to be doing. And so it's kind of this struggle and this balance. And I feel like in some ways I'm consistently and always putting off grieving if I feel like I should be grieving the loss or death of the life that I wanted to begin with, and should I be grieving? Should I grieve it? Is it dead? Should I stop playing music and trying to do it for real? Or whatever the thing may be. And that's kind of just an underlying tone of grief in my life all the time that I don't have in everyday life. And I have to spend my life every single day doing the thing that I don't want to do. So the idea of what you're saying about grieving something from a long time ago or not accepting the information that is available to us to try to receive that and process that and learn from it and grow from it is definitely actually makes a lot of sense to me right now, specifically from that perspective, because it's definitely what I'm dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really easy for us to want to gaslight our own emotions with grief and say, like, oh, I have nothing to grieve. People have it harder. Like, things are fine, right? Like, oh, I should be happy. It's fine. I have a great life now. That can be true. You can have a great life and still be sad about aspects of your life, right? Your life can be objectively great. That's the intellectualizing thing again, right? To say this is great and it doesn't feel as great as it should. And that's telling you that there's a dissonance in your life, and there's telling you that there's a part of you that's still grieving it. I think also grieving a church system and grieving any belief structure at all, whether it's church or not, is really specific and really difficult, because that tells you what you're supposed to do, what you're supposed to believe, what happens after you die. It tells you how to be and how to succeed, how not to succeed, right? Like, it's so prescriptive. Right. You don't have to face the idea that you could be wrong. You don't have to face the idea that you are making your own moral choices, that you are your own person. That's a lot of pressure, right? Especially for a 5 who wants to think through everything, who wants to be very sure, who wants to have all the information. And the reality is, when you leave any structure like that, whether it's a job or school or a religion, you're a different person and you have to learn it all over again, right? You learn what your life is, you learn who you are again. And that can feel, it's really difficult to find a balance again sometimes when that feels like you don't have control because you're still learning. It can feel like you're pushed like back several years. So it would make sense to grieve those things. Even if you don't miss them, you can still grieve them, which is another interesting distinction. You don't have to miss something or want it back in your life to grieve it.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I feel that. I understand a little bit of that whole idea of loving your life now, but also still grieving something else about it and having to separate those two so you don't feel bad about yourself.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because oftentimes people will say like, well, it doesn't fit into one emotion, and that's okay. We're adults and it shouldn't, right? That's actually a developmental milestone in childhood when a kid starts to lie willingly. They hold the truth and they hold this lie, and they're able to hold two different things in their mind at the same time. And now as adults, we hopefully often don't choose to lie, but we do often have to hold more than one emotion. So we say, I'm happy and I'm sad. I'm angry and I miss it. I love this and I hate this, right? And that's often what grief is too, is really just sussing out all of those almost juxtaposed emotions and figuring out what that even means for you, because we talk about grief like it's this coverall term. And I guess it kind of is, but it looks so different for everyone. Like, no two people grieve the same because no two people really feel the same in their grief.
I do have some experience with grief. Traditionally, as a 5, I have not dealt with grief well because it is a mismatch for me in the emotional realm and the logical realm. I can get really on board with a lot of emotions and the logic behind them, but for grief, when you lose something, it's like, well, it's gone and there's no use crying over spilt milk, so let's move on, let's figure it out, let's try something new. And sitting in that space and just allowing yourself to feel the full range of grief is something I do find difficult. I will say that grief hits me harder when it is the loss of an idea and not the loss of people or things. I still grieve people, but people don't mean as much to the core of who I am as ideas do. And that probably makes me sound like a terrible person, but here we are. That's the 5 non-attachment coming into place. And sometimes that non-attachment ends up being a little bit more like detachment.
I think grief can be excruciating for 5s. We feel so deeply, but we don't naturally know how to identify or process it. And it's also really hard because people don't see our grief, so they don't necessarily believe that we have it. I remember when I was a kid and my grandpa died, and I felt like a total monster because I just didn't cry. Like, I felt sad, but like the tears didn't come. And I remember lying in bed one night, like forcing myself to cry because I felt like so inhumane for not shedding tears over his death. Because isn't that what you're supposed to do when somebody dies? Over the years, I have learned that I process grief differently from others, and that's okay. But I just wish that the display of tears wasn't like the only marker for somebody experiencing grief.
I want to shift gears here a little bit because I want to come back around. There's a question that came up when Cody and I were recording. For a little bit of context here, I've always felt like kind of a weirdo when it comes to death and grief. And this conversation is really helping me frame grief better. And because I can now recognize, there's a lot of stuff that I grieve. And so having thought about it mostly around the idea of death, I wasn't really looking at grief holistically. But my wife's mother passed away a couple months ago, and she was really close to her mom, so there's already like, it's a very emotional thing to lose your parent so young. She's also a 4, and so she feels things strongly anyway. So like putting those things together, that's a lot of intense feelings. And me as a 5, I realize now, you reminded me of the word intellectualizing rather than feeling. I was kind of doing that, and I haven't really had anyone super close to me pass. I felt like I couldn't really relate at that level, but I also have just never really had a problem with death. And we broke that apart a little bit when Cody and I were chatting about it. But the question came up of like, do I feel that way because there's some sort of like hidden thing that's really wrong, or if this is like an actual like normal healthy way to look at it, or somewhere in between? Like, I have no idea. But I've never really felt super attached to life. And I think that that's part of it. And I'm just wondering how those two things interplay, because I could see, and I don't know if this is something that I do or do much, but I could see a way like we possibly detach because we fear the grief, or we don't want to, we don't want to experience grief. So maybe we detach so that we can preemptively not grieve. I don't know. Have you come across, like, is there a concept that you've come across in that regard?
Absolutely. And I think there's, a couple different things that could be going on. To your question, sometimes people do detach from it and they say, well, life is futile, everyone dies, like, que sera, sera, we're moving on, right? And that's kind of sweeping under the rug, and often, like, emotions don't go away if you suppress them. They just come out in more inconvenient times. So really, you won't know until later when things come out and you're realizing, like, maybe you're all of a sudden very scared about a pet passing, or all of a sudden, like, a plant dies and it really affects you for some reason, right? Or all of these other things can come out. So if you've never had anyone close to you die, there's no real way to know. It could also be that some people, especially 4s, are able to really accept like the beauty of life more deeply. So then they're able to also accept the sorrow more deeply, and they more fully understand than 5s, especially, that you have to have both. That you don't just get to pick the positive emotions, that you also have to experience the negative ones. And in that, it becomes easier to deal in the long term with emotions like grief, because grief isn't something that eventually resolves and you forget about it, right? It's always a little bit there. So that could also be what's going on. I think that grief is something that we learn specifically in childhood, because we don't even really have a concept of death until we're much older than knowing what grief feels like. Like, you can have a stuffed animal, like, lose it and feel very sad about it. And likely that child is feeling grief, even though they don't know what the concept of death is. And how we're taught to deal with that grief and how we see other people deal with that grief who are close to us is what we learn and internalize. And so often people who have traumatic deaths in their family growing up, or who grow up in a very religious setting, or grow up and don't ever have to talk about death, that largely influences how they deal with it as an adult, because it's not really something that comes up until usually you're older. So you don't get to practice, and we rely on the only skills that we have, which are the ones that we learned as children. So some people have parents who tell them, like, people are going to heaven and hell, right? And that can feel comforting or scary. And some people have parents who say, like, everyone comes to butterflies and everything is fine, and like life is futile, but it's happy, right? And so that's going to be a very different time when you're an adult and experiencing death for the first time in those two cases. And often what we have to do in therapy is kind of track it back to, okay, what was your first experience of grief? How do you remember your parents talking about it? How did your teachers talk about it? How did your friends talk about it? What was your play like? And kind of dissecting if that's a framework that you want to continue to use, because it's often something that we use without even considering if it's ours. We just kind of take it for granted and consider that it's something that we've learned and that's just what we do. So it's really looking at it and considering if that's something that we'd want to continue doing and how we'd want to continue to process grief.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm like thinking through, like, I'm always thinking of the things that we learn as children, whether it's passing down from our parents, or I'm kind of always processing that in myself and in others. And yeah, grief for sure. But that's interesting with Josiah, because you did grow up like in an evangelical setting. And so it's interesting for you to have the feelings and the perspective you do on life and death, and because of the upbringing that you had. It's they are like the conflicting viewpoints.
Well, yeah, I was unpacking that a little bit. I think that if I were to have a therapy session right here and just go ahead and dig into it, 'cause this is apparently what we do here on Enneagram 5.
It was Cody last time. It's your turn now. It's only fair.
Right?
True. It's only fair.
That is fair. But life isn't fair, Cody.
I hear some grief in what you're saying.
Growing up religiously the way that we did, I guess death was always framed as it's not a big deal. It's just sort of part of life, and we're here for a time, and we have a purpose, and we do our best to fulfill that purpose, and then we move on. And I don't know if that was ever expressly communicated to me and explained in that way, but that's sort of what I picked up. And then when I left the religion piece behind, even the idea of God that I had constructed, I don't know if I carried that sort of outlook through and reframed it a bit, but it's very similar to how I feel about death now. It's just, I guess I still have a pretty spiritual, for lack of a better word, outlook on it of just like, there's no way for me to know what happens after I die. So like, why worry about it? I'm here now. I know that it's not going to last forever, and it's not something that I can control. So why should I let it bother me? But I think the thing that bothers me is I don't feel like anyone else I know feels that way about it. And so when other people around me that I care about are experiencing grief from having someone close to them die, I feel like I should be there for them, but I feel incompetent to do so because I can't relate in the way. And so I do my best. I try to give them space to feel what they feel. That's just the best thing I can think of to do, but that's where I'm at. And that's what I've worked through a lot of this over the last couple of months, but her mom went into hospice on New Year's, and she passed in April, and so it was definitely this longer, more drawn out process so there was already a lot of grieving that was happening before she even passed, and then when she did, it was it just intensified, and I guess I felt bad that I didn't feel that bad. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like what we would call secondary grief. There are a lot of secondary emotions. Anxiety and grief are two of the most common. So secondary grief would be feeling grief about someone else's grief, but it's not the same thing that they're grieving, right? Like you're just sad for them. And that's a type of empathy. One of the quotes that I lean on in my therapy practice pretty heavily is when the quote says, "When we have nothing left to offer our patients, we offer them our humanity." And that comes up every day. I can't relate to everything they always say, just like you can't relate in the way that your wife is experiencing this emotion. But you can offer her humanity. That's what we can do for each other, especially fives who don't really feel emotions super deeply, who often don't relate to a lot of emotions, but know how to make space for people, right? Like know how to sit and listen and really be interested. And often that's what people need, especially in grieving. They just need people to be there because in grieving a person, it's the loss of someone. There's another component that you mentioned that I would consider radical acceptance. So that's a whole school of thought and therapy, but radical acceptance kind of says so it goes, if you've ever read Kurt Vonnegut, right? So kind of like whatever happens, and there's nothing I can do about it, so might as well be here now. And I think in religious contexts, that's pretty heavily pressed into you, right? Like you have to talk about death a lot, even if it's not directly saying you're human and you're going to die one day. You're talking about heaven, you're talking about hell, you're talking about essentially your whole life is getting ready for death. Like you're getting ready for what comes next. And that's kind of true. The point of your life, and getting other people ready for what comes next. And your life is framed around this idea of dying. And that's kind of morbid, but it is true. So you're in that way, desensitized to it, not necessarily in a bad way, just in a way that it's almost colloquial to you as a child if you're raised in a very religious context. So when someone close to you dies, you're like, yeah, I knew that. I knew people died. And I think also with parents, it's different because as children, we think that they live forever. And as adults, we often don't challenge that belief because it's not a comfortable one to challenge. So even if you know that someone is going to die and they're on hospice, you've never had to challenge that belief before. So the grieving process starts in that moment, whereas you never had the belief that they were going to live forever. You never had the belief that anyone was going to live forever because you were living to die to have a better afterlife. And so it's just a different framework to approach it from. I don't think it's wrong. I don't think either of them are wrong. It's just learning how to interact with the two frameworks in a way that both people feel heard and both people feel validated.
Well, and coming at it from different places too, a good example is how you processed the situation versus how, Amy processed the situation. You guys both came from evangelical backgrounds, but like, we've had these conversations together, the three of us, about how different all three of us come out of this religious background and see things differently, like, and how we were taught about like heaven or hell or death or the afterlife, and the hope of someone never really truly dying, and how those kinds of things have that impact on us throughout our life. And yeah, I mean, I don't think I actually realized how much it impacted me until it was gone, until I broke it all down and didn't have that framework. And so that impacted me differently. And then maybe this is just a good example of like a 6-wing versus a 4-wing, I don't know, because I feel like Josiah and I have different perspectives that tend to line up with these things, where like things that cause me anxiety, he's completely okay with pretty much across the board.
Yeah, it's true.
Every time I try to talk to him about what I'm anxious about or what's like upsetting me, he's like, can't relate. Every time.
We have a lot of practice making space for each other.
Yeah, for sure. That's true. And so I think, it's funny to see how that can impact people differently, even from coming from similar backgrounds. Well, in some ways, like the circles, Venn diagram, it crosses here and there, but definitely different. It's funny to me too how you can project, right? Like something can happen. Like a really great example of compartmentalization in this way is how hard I tried to compartmentalize my emotions when my grandmother died, actually, like when she actually died. And it didn't come out until 2 weeks later when my cat unexpectedly died, that I had for almost 20 years and lived a very
unexpected
long time.
And you had it for 20 years. Are you sure?
So she was so like spry and lively that I forgot how old she was. Like, I'll put it that way. So it wasn't like at the front of my mind how old she was. And then one day she had like a really runny nose and her eye was like running really bad. And I was like, oh, something's like wrong. She like has some kind of sinus problem. I took her in, and my friend was the vet, and he was like, he looked in her mouth and he was like, yeah, there's actually a hole going from her mouth to her brain. She has cancer, and this tumor has finally eaten through her head. She needs to be put down today. So I took her to the vet, not thinking she was dying. And so, because she acted perfectly normal, except for a snotty nose, acted like she had a cold. And so I was not expecting that at all. And so I took her to the vet and ended up having to sit there and hold her while she died. So like very different experience than what I expected 2 weeks after my grandmother died. And so I had this like dam of emotion that was being held back that I didn't actually realize until I got to the car after I left the vet, and lost my shit for the first time since my best friend of childhood died when I was 19. So like that was the two connecting moments for me that like were the same. Like I could make that connection of like, this is what this felt like. And yeah, I think it was in that moment I probably decided I'm never going to do that again. I'm never going to compartmentalize those emotions because I don't want it to build up like that. That's a little self-preserving, right? Like I don't want to be that out of control again, is actually kind of what that translates to. I would rather feel it in part throughout the time of experiencing it and not hold it back and have it just come out all at once. And because I did it 2 times in my life and I don't want to do it again. And so but in a weird way, it's kind of come full circle where I have tried to find healthier ways of, coping and processing and feeling those emotions, so that it doesn't happen like that to where, and there's nothing wrong with it bursting out like a flood, but like if it doesn't have to, if you can process it in the way that your body wants to process it, then why try to manipulate it?
I do have experience with grief. Many people in my life have died, but the biggest, most intense grief that I've experienced is the death of my son, Rory. He died 88 days of life for no reason of since. It's been 8 years since he died, and that process has been life-altering. I definitely am not the same person that I was before. Grief has brought me through a huge range of emotion and definitely has built just a stable space for empathy. And I think how I've processed grief really over the last 8 years is allowing myself to feel everything that I feel whenever and wherever I am. And then to ask the questions of why do I feel that way, and dig very, very far into why I feel that way, reliving the moments, recounting all of those things, feeling it hundreds of times. And the other thing that really helped was that being part of a support group for other people who had children that were about Rory's age who died from various reasons. We did that for 3 years, every other week, like clockwork. And it was a safe place to listen and hear other people's stories. And then the final thing that really helped me process was to just read all night long, many, many, many nights, a website called Standing Still. And it's about an online magazine for people whose children have died.
You know, I'm realizing this, especially now that Liz is here. But I think that like every time we do these things, Cody, we're doing some form of like talk therapy, but it's just amplified when Liz is here.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I'm listening to you talk right now, and I'm like, Cody, before we started this podcast, would not be able to like unpack that in the way that he did. And that's what we've been practicing. Like we didn't necessarily go into this intending that, but that's what we've learned through just having conversations with each other over the last year plus about deep things and emotional things and, all that.
Well, and it's having that performative aspect of it, like knowing that we're on stage to talk about ourselves, I think also makes it gives an agenda, right? So like I sat down.
Hide too.
But right. Well, and I committed to it before we ever started the first episode. I knew what it was going to be about. I knew what we were going to have to do. And I told myself, okay, yeah, I'm okay with this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to commit to this because I know it's going to be good for me. I know it's going to be in the long run, it's going to be really healthy for me. And it's good for me to put myself out there like that. And I mean, and we've put ourselves out there in such ways that we've been questioned by trolls that we're not fives. And so, that's been kind of fun because I kind of like that. I like that kind of adrenaline rush of throwing all of my deepest, because I never did that my entire life, not with anyone. And so it took me a long time to get to that place where I was ready to process things and process them on the fly. Like we talk about this in one of the episodes in the upcoming season. Like our entire first season, we had no idea what we were talking about every time we got together. And it ended up being a great season of all these great topics that we had because we had so much to pull from. We hadn't even talked yet. And so the idea of sitting down and the first few times I went over to Josiah's house to record was terrifying. I would like have to talk. I just keep driving. It's fine. I don't know what's going to happen tonight. And I was like so anxious about it because I had no idea what we were going to talk about. And that terrified me to death. And so, and then it got by the end of the season, I was like, I don't care what we talk about. Like it's going to be great. Whatever we do, it'll be great. And so, the second season was when I had the most fun producing this podcast, I think, because I knew what I was getting into. I had an agenda even more so because I was like, there's some topics that I actually want to talk about. And now that I have these tools in my tool bag of like ways to talk about things and ways to process things, now I want to do it. Now I look forward to it. So much so that I've been in therapy the last few weeks for the first time in my life. And the therapist, I actually think I might switch therapists, but he was just like, honestly, like you're incredibly self-aware. You process things out loud while you're sitting here with me. I don't know how to help you right now. And he's like, every time I'd bring something up, he's like, yeah, but I mean, you're handling it really well. Like you're processing it the way that I would give you the advice to process these things and like challenge you to do these things. You're kind of already doing it. But I also realized halfway through one of our sessions that I found out that he is religious, and I didn't know that going into it. I thought he wasn't, and I was like, I don't want a religious therapist. I don't want that. I know I would question everything that he says, that it might be coming from that perspective, even if it's trying to be neutral. So it kind of ruined it for me. But Yeah, I'm getting sidetracked. All that to say, this podcast has been really great for me in the fact that, yeah, it's 100% talk therapy. And the musical project I'm working on right now, where I am talking about like that story of everything that I went through in religion, and not like on the nose talking about it, but trying to cover all these topics from the last like 10, 15 years of my life and putting it into something that's really personal for me and something that I've kind of always wanted to do. There's no way I would have been able to do that before this podcast. I wouldn't have been able to process these emotions in a way to put it in something in an art form. Like I wouldn't have been able to do it. And like I wrote a song just 2 days ago about the moment in the shower and having to process that and finding some kind of way to get the listener into the moment that I was feeling without explaining it, without talking about it as though I'm talking about it right now. Right. And so that was an incredible challenge, and something now songwriting is kind of, it's not me just writing these songs and because I like writing songs. It's a challenge for me to try to figure out ways to make a listener empathize with something that I feel or think instead of explaining it. And that's something that's very hard for me as a 5. So major challenge, leaning hard, trying to lean into a 4-wing when I'm doing those things. But yeah, it's amazing to me the place that I currently am in as a person, knowing where I was 10 years ago. Like it's a wild difference.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that that's how like all of my challenging starts. It's interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned that you just began processing your emotions and like not compartmentalizing, because I think that everybody has to process emotions all the time, right? Like we just choose to process them constructively, or we choose to not process them. And in the act of not processing them, they decide how they're going to come out, right? So you mentioned like pulling people into letting people into your emotions, right? Letting people into that vulnerability of that moment in the shower with the song. I think in that way, you wanted to share an emotion with someone, right? Like you wanted that connection of sharing an emotion, because that is something human that we want when we are feeling any intense emotion, is to share that with someone and know that they understand. And when we don't have that connection otherwise, similar to grief, when we don't have an outlet, when we don't have a constructive outlet to let people into our emotions, we'll find a way to rope them into the emotion that they can't deny. So like anger, right? We'll project anger onto them, which often goes hand in hand with grief, because people have to respond to it, right? It's outward. If you're yelling, if you're angry, if you're throwing things, like people are going to react. And even if they don't react, they're in the emotion with you, as opposed to sitting and saying like, hey, listen to the song. Hey, I want to invite you into this moment.
Yeah, I also think too, I've been thinking a lot about just the overall experience of aging and how nobody really prepares you for the different parts of your life that you experience throughout life. Like there's no way for people to really, like, you know, your parents try to explain to you what it's like to get older, right? Or your grandparents or whatever, and they tell you all these stories. And I never really understood it. And like I constantly question my age. And it's a really strange thing. I think about this. I've thought about this a lot through my 20s, late 20s, especially, and then early 30s, and how like I still feel young. I feel like I can do whatever I want. Like I'm not in the best shape, but like I still feel like I can do things. It wasn't until this year where like going downstairs hurts my knees and like things start popping and cracking in ways that you don't expect. And things are a little harder all of a sudden. And that's honestly a lot of the reason why I'm like, I got to get in the gym and be consistent. I want the last, later parts of my life to not be miserable and a slow crawl to death, right? Like I want to like be able to do things. And so it's kind of hit me now, I think, because I'm maybe more aware. But I remember talking to my dad about this a few years ago, and I was like, I can't believe that I'm in my 30s. Like, I just don't feel like I'm in my 30s. And he goes, yeah, you always feel that way. You're always going to feel that way. And I was like, what do you mean? He goes, in my 50s, I felt like I was 30. He was like, you never really age past 30 for whatever reason. In your mind, you see yourself as 30 and you feel 30. And he's like, until you get to a place where like your body actually starts falling apart, you think you can do all the things. And I remember that's true. My uncle, until he was 60, he would be out there playing, throwing football with us and Thanksgiving and doing all these things. So he was in his 60s. And my dad was the same way. He used to run and do all kinds of crazy stuff. And it's kind of funny to think about. But like, yeah, I kind of like just consistently feel like I had this moment the other day where I was looking at a picture of somebody who was supposedly 35. And I was like, there's no way they're 35. They look way too old. And and it turns out I did a deep dive and they weren't 35. That picture was inaccurate, but it brought up this whole point where I was like, I found a picture of them at 35 and I was like, they still kind of look old. And then I'm like, do I look that old? Shit. And I see pictures of myself and it's like this weird reverse dysmorphia in some way, I guess. Like it's not the way where like people, I feel like, I don't know if it's like, dysmorphia in the sense of like with eating disorders and things like that, which I feel like hear about a lot in more mainstream conversations about it. But like, I feel like I'm in good shape. I feel like I'm skinnier than I am. I feel like I'm in better shape than I am because I don't ever, my weight never is usually an issue. Like it doesn't get in my way. I can still, touch my toes or do crunches or do things that I want to do for the most part. And so I don't think of myself. And then I see like, I was just at a work like retreat thing and I saw pictures of me playing music on stage and I saw myself and I was like, oh my God, how do I look like that in real life? It's just such a weird experience. I look old and fat. And so anyway, there's a lot.
If you need someone to remind you of that often, I'm right here.
You're like, I'll take on that job. I'll put that weight on my shoulders.
I love you that much, Cody. I'll just call you up every day. Cody, good morning. You're old and fat.
You're welcome. Click. Click. What am I doing? Phones don't click.
But you're not old, right?
Yeah, I'm not old.
Phones click.
But yeah, but in all that to say, I actually have recently been kind of just like slowly and comfortably processing the grief of getting older in that way and having to realize like, maybe I shouldn't run as hard as I used to because my max heart rate is now lower than it used to be. And I shouldn't probably push my heart that hard, things like that, those realizations of just mortality, I guess. And, I process my anxiety surrounding death that has been there for the past few years has been diluted down out of anxiety and more into just like a grieving process of mortality and having to come around to this idea of not lasting forever and therefore trying really hard to embrace practices of gratefulness and gratefulness for moments because they only happen once every moment. And so, when there are good moments, when there are good things that happen, taking that time to take a breather and appreciate those things and appreciate the people in your life and the moments in your life that means something and letting that be kind of a part of the grief, like grieving them as they pass and appreciating them at the same time. And so, and I don't think I would have looked at it that way, except for the fact that you defined grief the way you did in this conversation. And now I'm like, oh yeah, I guess I'm pretty much constantly grieving all things.
Yeah. Another component of that too, of fear of death is a fear of regretting what you didn't accomplish in your life, right? A fear of feeling not fulfilled. And again, that's just more information to tell you, okay, well, what would I regret not doing? Well, you have time to do it now, right? Or thinking about, I feel like I'm getting older. That can be hard because it changes who we feel like we are. And like there can be grief around our identity, but there can also be grief around what we didn't do when we were younger, right? What we didn't appreciate, what we didn't think about. I remember I had a similar moment where when I was younger, I would see like the Olympians or like the big kid stars and think like, well, I'm not that old yet, so maybe I can still do that someday, right? And I remember this like distinct moment when I was probably like 21 in college where I was watching the Olympics and I thought, oh my God, these gymnasts are younger than me. And like, I knew I wasn't going to the Olympics, right? Like I've always known that. But for some reason, I was like, oh, there are things in my life that I'm not going to do. And I think that's a very common thing that we kind of all have to come to terms with at some point. And that can look different for certain people. In grieving the things that the opportunities we missed, maybe let's pretend like it could have been an opportunity for me to ever go to the Olympics, right? But like grieving, you didn't continue with music, you didn't continue with church, you didn't, do X, Y, Z, and also accepting that your life is good now despite those things. And that's where happiness and kind of the radical acceptance piece comes in grieving them and appreciating them and moving through the process into something that you can continue to want to live for and into a life that you can feel fulfilled to at the end. So you can look back when you are old and, at the last stage of your life and say like, wow, I mean, there are more things I could have done, but I'm very happy with what I did and I'm ready.
Right. Yeah. That's something that's like, I think about that a lot, about like how it must feel to be in the last stages of your life and hopefully be lucky enough to be ready to die, because like sometimes people are. I mean, the way my grandmother died, I remember we were sitting in the doctor's office and she was like and we were there because she had been getting so much weaker and like just suddenly like feeling like she was declining all of a sudden. And they're like, oh yeah, it turns out you have 2 different kinds of cancer, and they're like, we can treat it, but we really don't need to if you don't want to. Like, you're old enough at this point, like it's up to you how you want to do it. And they were like, but at this stage, you'll probably go fairly quick, and they just told her that. And then she just looked at them, smiled, and said, no, I'm ready. I've lived a good life. I'm happy with my life. I'm ready for it to be over. And that was hard for me to sit there and listen to her say that, because I was like, wow. And I don't think I thought about it till way later. It's like, what does that feeling feel like? Because that is the opposite of how I feel right now. I have all these things I want to do. There's so much that I still want to develop or, experience. I want to go to Europe. It's like all kinds of things that I want to do.
I think we've all felt that at certain points in our life. Like when you decided to leave the church, I would be willing to bet that you thought, okay, this has served me well, and now I'm done. I'm moving on. When you decide to stop whatever you were doing, Josiah, and write your book for 30 days, you think, okay, this is the chapter I'm moving into. When the person from my previous example decides that they're going to quit their job and raise their family, then that's great, right? And that's how we process through grief in the moment, is really looking at it and saying, am I ready to let this go? Is this something that I can move through in my life and be happy and appreciate what I've done and feel fulfilled in that and move to the next thing? And as we practice that in small moments in our lives, with job transitions, with families, with friends, with relationships, with whatever that looks like, that's how we prepare for the final transition into death. And knowing that every step that we've made, every transition that we've made, every decision we've had to process, we have grieved appropriately and also felt deep appreciation and a deep sense of being ready to move on to the next thing. And also approaching it non-judgmentally. If you're not ready, that's okay. Just look at it inquisitively, look at it openly, and think, is this really something I'm ready to leave? Is this grief because I loved it so much that I'm excited to move on to the next thing? Or is it because it's telling me that I actually don't feel like I've done everything I'm supposed to do in this moment yet?
Grief can be a strange thing. My grandmother passed away a couple of years ago, and I wasn't sure how to process her death. And several months went by, and I kept feeling like I needed to do something to remember her, to honor her. And something just came into my head where I remember playing as a boy in her backyard, and she always had wind chimes outside, and I just felt like I needed to buy a wind chime. So I found one that sounded like the one that she had, and I put that up outside my house. And now every time I hear it, I think of her. I mean, just the process and the action of doing that was almost a way of me physically processing the grief. And so I came to a peace about that, her dying.
I have a lot of experience with grief, and the 5 in me tends to try to solve the root of whatever's causing my feelings of grief in order to stop feeling it as quickly as possible. And sometimes with grief specifically, there's not really a solve. And at those points, that's usually when my stressor or disintegration 7 kicks in, and I just get hyper fixated on having fun, being distracted, doing as much as I physically can to fill my plate so that I don't have time or energy to feel those feelings.
I really like that idea, and I really can appreciate that perspective, because that even just like right now kind of helps me like frame a lot of these kind of thoughts and feelings that I've been having lately, just kind of thinking through my life and what I want to do next and what I'm doing right now. And I think the person that I am now and the things that I'm doing now and the things that I'm trying to spend my time doing and putting my energy into are the things that I really wanted to do when I was 19, but I wasn't able to do it. I wasn't going to do it then. If I could go back and violently shake the shoulders of 19-year-old me, then maybe things would be different, but probably not, because I wouldn't believe them. I wouldn't believe me now. And so, if I have to just kind of accept that it's happening now, and I'm here now, and I can appreciate it now, and I can give it my all now, what I have to give, and see what happens.
You actually have way more to give now because you've been through the things that you've been through. That's what I'm experiencing in this book. Is I wanted to write a book for a long time, and even like the topic of my book is something that came to me like 5 years ago when I was kind of going through what I'm writing about now. And I met my book writing coach through my last podcast, and was getting ready to start working with him to write the book at the beginning of 2020, and then everything, went to shit. And so and that just disrupt. But even in that gap of like the last 2 years, where I am now, to Liz's point, she's exactly right when she said like there was something that happened. I don't know what it was. It was like a switch flipped in my head at the end of last year, where I got this just intuitive sense. I have to write this now. This is the time. I don't know why. I just know that I'm heading towards something. I have to go through this process to prepare me for whatever's next. I have to get this book out of me. But by doing it now, it's a different book than it would have been even 2 years ago. And it's a better book. And there's more, I have more perspective. I've gone through the process a little bit more to where I can see better what's on the other side of it. And so it's an interesting balance of grieving what could have, I could have written the book when I was 19, but I wouldn't have had anything to write about. I had to live my life first, and now I could talk about it.
It's kind of that same idea with music. Like I feel like 19-year-old me would hear some of the songs that I've written in the last week and go, man, I wish I could write songs like that. And, I needed that life experience. I needed that wisdom that you can only gain with time. And, there's a reason why most of my favorite songwriters that are still living are in their 40s, 50s, and even early 60s. It's because they write the best songs because they have the best stories. They've lived them, and they have this library of experience and of tools in their toolkit that I don't have yet, and that I'm only just now starting to develop and sharpen, I guess, if we're going to go in on the tools metaphor. And I've been a musician my entire life. I'm just now writing things that I'm really proud of. And I actually think, wow, I think these are good. Like, I'm not just putting this stuff out there because I feel like that's what I'm supposed to do because I'm a musician, a songwriter, and I like to do it, blah, 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 etc. I'm actually doing it because I feel like I'm adding something to the noise of the world, and hopefully other people will find value in that the way that I found value in creating it. And that's something that I've never had before. And so I'm actually more excited about doing something in the music realm than I've ever been because I feel more capable than I've ever been. It's helped me a lot. I don't feel bad about what I didn't do in music before and I've let go of that simply because I feel like I'm actually able to do what I've always wanted to do now. I'm actually capable of doing that. And so it is kind of a weird experience to think about that too, and put that into perspective. I guess I wish I could have known this 20 years ago, but I didn't. So here we are.
Yeah. The right thing at the wrong time is still the wrong thing. Right.
Yeah.
And that is just such a picture of emotional growth. It's similar to the Enneagram as a ladder spectrum. First, you have to be able to identify and sit with whatever your own emotions are and process through them. Then you have to be able to communicate them. Then you have to be able to invite others in. Then you have to be able to have the skills to put those into something that you're proud of and to a vulnerability that you feel like the world needs and that you feel proud of sharing. And that's growth. That's why we often hold on to these dreams for so long, because we are not really ready to quite release them yet, because we're not really fully into who we're going to be at that time. And all of these experiences of grief and of emotions and learning how to talk about them prepare us for those things, because especially as a 5 who doesn't usually intuitively have all of this language to talk about emotions, you're not going to be able to invite someone into something that you don't understand. Nobody can do that, especially not 5s. A 4 child, they will have 17 journals. A 5 will have a dictionary that they love and are bonded to, right? And we'll help we'll learn about it. And it makes sense that it takes a while because that's what's comfortable.
Well, even on that note, I had an experience recently where it's a perfect example of that, where my friend who I play music with, and we've kind of entered in this phase where we're kind of both on the same page about challenging ourselves and each other in music and trying to create something new. And that's been really fun. And the other day we got together and decided we were going to try to co-write and see what would happen. And what actually ended up happening was he did what I do. He shared his opinion on what he thought could make the song better. that I was sharing with him, all these things. What it actually made me feel like was that I couldn't do anything right, that he was actually going to like, I was feeling like incredibly like broken down and kind of judged by that situation. And I didn't really hold it against him. I knew what was happening, and I wasn't at that moment able to necessarily separate what he was telling me with what I actually wanted and what I knew that I needed to do. And, but the good example of this is I didn't tell him that until today. And that was last weekend. And he was like, why didn't you just tell me that in the moment? And I was like, couldn't have done it in the moment. I needed time to process it. It wasn't until right in this moment when I'm telling you that I was able to fully articulate it in a way that I could communicate it to you. And so even now, doesn't matter how, even now in my all-knowing status after this podcast and be able to communicate my feelings, I still need a week and a half of processing time. I'm still the slowest computer in the 60s.
I think that's like something so beautiful about fives, though, is that when they do share an emotion, it's because they've packaged it. And I think I said this last time too, like they've packaged it and they are ready to share it. Mm-hmm. They've thought about what that means. They've thought about how to say it. They've thought about the repercussions, and they still are willingly giving it to you. And that's a type of intentional vulnerability that I think not a lot of other types have. Fours, juxtaposed are a good example, where they're wonderfully beautiful and emotional, and they share it with a lot of people. And in that way, it's part of who they are, but it's not as sacred, not in a religious context, right? But as in like a one-to-one, like space kind of way. But if a five is sharing that with someone, right, like you've thought about it, you know what you're going to say, and you've clearly put a lot of time into it. And you've also put a lot of effort, like emotional back labor, to even learn what that emotion is, right? And that's a hallmark of you wanting to outreach an olive branch to this relationship and saying, like, I've put a lot of work into this moment to be here as a friend for you. Will you accept this? And that's pretty beautiful.
Yeah, that's true. It's the way we love. It's kind of I feel like it applies in ways to also like how I, especially in my 30s, like the older you get, the harder it is to break habits and things that you're just like you've wired yourself to be. Yeah, I always say like to be in a relationship with somebody, to be getting in a relationship with somebody who's in their 30s is really hard, because like to break them of bad habits or ways that they're stuck in their ways. It's like a common, I feel like, phrase in conversation, or common topic. And I'm definitely no different, simply because I am a person of routine. It's the only way I can function, is that I have to have routines or nothing ever happens. I'll forget all of my life saving medications I need to take. Like things that are really good for me just won't happen if I don't have the routine to do them every day. And so it's taken me a really long time to break bad habits. And I think that on the relationship episode last season, where we brought our significant others on, I feel like Madison had a good bit of stuff. I don't know if it all made it into the final episode. That's the privilege I have as the producer. I can edit things out that I don't like. But there were things I remember her saying back then about like all these things that, just I do that just like drive her insane. But some of it is a five, but also some of it is just like me being stuck in my ways. And the hard thing about being in a relationship with fives, or men probably, and
or you specifically,
me specifically, especially that part, the emphasis on that.
I think that it sounds like even since the last time that all three of us talked, however long ago that was, there has been growth, right? Like I can see that even in how we were talking about the emotion wheel, and you guys were like, how are there that many emotions? And this time I've heard things like, I don't even know, like I felt vulnerable in that moment. And that is, I don't think, something that either one of you said at all last time. So I think even in like seeing that coming onto this podcast again has been really interesting to talk about. Yeah, just see all the growth and all of the introspection, and I think should give hope to lots of other fives that you, just like anything else, you can also learn this if this is something that you want to learn, right? Emotions and introspection.
Yeah, and hopefully people are seeing us grow, right? They're going on this journey with us at this point. We've now made it a public journey, and that's a super fun thing to do. Hopefully I've enjoyed that from other people, and I've wanted to be that person that could do that. So just kind of jumping in the deep end and trying to make it happen. Also, too, one of the main reasons why I wanted you to be a recurring guest is because of how much I got out of our last conversation and took a lot of it to heart. Yeah, and I took a lot of it to heart. I knew that I wasn't a sociopath, but I wanted to have that conversation because there's a lot of things I did want to dig into and kind of unpack. And you, in ways that didn't surprise me, you surprised me, if that makes sense. Like you said things that I didn't expect you to say. There was a lot of places you went that I was like, oh, holy shit! Like I've never thought of that like that before. And I loved that. That's what you've actually set a really high standard for me for therapy. I think I'm like, I kind of feel like I need.
Thank you so much.
I need that in therapy. I need people to like blow my mind with something where I'm like, I never thought about that before. That's so crazy. I love that. And actually my friend Cody, he's been telling me, he's like, I've been telling him about my therapy sessions. He's like, you need a new therapist. He's the one who planted it in my head to begin with. And I'm like, you're probably right. And then this last one, I was like, I need a therapist.
I think if any point your therapist says like, I can't help you, then like believe them.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Because obviously you have all kinds of nuggets of wisdom to give to me, but that's definitely something that I think the last conversation really helped me grow and move forward in that regard. And also the fact that I had to go back and edit it, and I listened to it way more intently because I was listening to different things that I needed to cut out or filler words or whatever the thing was, and adding music to parts of it, right? Like it just made me put it into perspective that was much deeper, and like it really sunk in a lot of the things that were said in that. And it was weeks after that episode where I was processing that in such a deep and hopefully ways that was cementing it in my long-term memory and changing habits. And so I actually believe, hopefully I'm glad that you see those changes, because I think that you were a proponent of some of them. So that's good.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful to hear.
So, Liz, I just want to thank you once again for the free therapy.
The tax write-off.
I really appreciate your insights, and it's so helpful to have some outside perspective, especially from someone who's not a 5, but understands the Enneagram and works with a lot of different types of people. So it's been really helpful. So as we're kind of wrapping up here, I want to give you an opportunity. Do you have any sort of parting words or last bits of sage wisdom for everyone listening?
Do I have last bits of sage wisdom? I think the thing that I've kind of taken away most from this conversation is that everyone experiences grief differently. None of it's wrong, and we experience it every day. I think a lot of people fear grief because it seems huge and final and just so consuming. And it can be, but if we practice every day to experience the grief and look at unjudgmentally what it's trying to teach us, then we'll come out learning more from ourselves and also come out able to deal with the big grief better. And it won't seem as daunting if we're strong in small ways every day and facing it.
Love it.
Yeah.
Perfect place to end. Thank you, Liz.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thanks. Hey, it's Cody, and I wanted to say thank you for listening to this episode. I also want to give a special thanks to our community members who shared their voice with us. If you enjoyed this episode and you're the type of person who likes helping others, would you do us a favor and share it with other people like you? If you found value in this conversation, they will too. If anything in this conversation has resonated with you, or if you have any further thoughts or questions, I want to invite you to join our community of other people like you and continue the conversation at enneagram5.com.